Well, why don't we start? Uh, yeah, let's kind of get this ball rolling.
Okay.
So, welcome everybody to this guest of honor reading and interview with Tobias S. Buckell. We will start with a brief introduction to our lovely guest of honor, who you can see on the screen, who then will read something that I don't know yet what it is, so it's going to be interesting to find out. As we begin this conversation, just remember that there is the Discord you can throw questions up on. I will do my best to keep an eye on it, so you can bring your stuff there. So, briefly to introduce this guest, if you don't know who Tobias Buckell is, Tobias S. Buckell is a Caribbean author of science fiction and fantasy, and I think technically a little horror as well. There's a bit of horror in there. Originally from the island of Grenada, and who now resides in the landlocked Midwest state of Ohio, where sailing is a little complicated, just a bit. His work first appeared in the March 2000 issue of Science Fiction Age, beginning a decades-long and I would argue remarkable writing career. In the last 22 years, he's released 6 collections, dozens upon dozens of short stories, and 11 novels, including his most recent work for Audible, The Stranger in the Citadel, and my personal favorite, which is the Xeno Wealth series, which theoretically one day I'll get more of. His career has garnered him nominations for the Hugo, Nebula, Astounding, and World Fantasy Awards. He's also won a World Fantasy Award, which is fantastic. And he also has the deliciously economic title of New York Times best-selling author, which is fantastic. When he's not writing, obviously he's hanging out with his wife and daughters, attending apparently lots of random science presentations at conventions for inspiration. And he can be found teaching creative writing at Bluffton University and at the University of Maine's Stonecoast MFA in creative writing program. So, welcome, Tobias, again. For this is just great. I just love interviewing you and talking to you about your
Thank you
stuff.
so
So,
much. Um, yeah, thank you for the introduction. I'd like to meet that man. He sounds very accomplished and busy and not as panicked and clueless as I am. Um, so this is a reading and an interview. So I'm going to read a very short, about 8 minute short story. So you get a whole short story. I'm not going to leave you hanging from my latest short story collection, Shoggoths in Traffic and Other Stories. It's a collection of all of my fantasy short stories that kind of I wanted to pull together and put together an anthology that's out from Fairwood Press right now. And so this is a story that I wrote for Terraform magazine called Zombie Capitalism that Sean was just talking to me about right before we popped on. And I wrote this in 2019 for Terraform magazine, and it came out right at the beginning of lockdown, which meant that people really did not want to read it, because you'll see why in just a second. So this is Zombie Capitalism. The dogs started barking at the zombie in the pool long before Cheryl figured out what Zim and Garfield had gotten scent of. Zim, the German shepherd, crashed through the picture window to scrabble out after it. Cheryl yelled at the dogs to get back in the house as Garfield took off to join Zim at the chain fence around the pool. Then she heard the zombie splashing about in the shallow end. It snarled when it saw her, and she couldn't quite stifle a small scream as she realized a rotting corpse had pulled itself through a hole in the pool fence and then trailed blood and innards all across the decorative brick path before it collapsed in a cloud of black ichor into the crystal blue water. Cheryl ran back inside and got the Remington 7 from the rack by the door, loaded it, and worked the bolt by feel as she jogged to the back of the house. By the time she returned to the pool, the zombie flailed around in one of the corners, not able to pull itself out. A long, black tangle of intestines looped around the pool cleaner that had tied it up. Christ on a cracker! Cheryl grabbed Zim. Damn it, dog, stay here! She managed to get Zim's collar, but Garfield scrabbled off counterclockwise around the fence to wiggle through the damn hole. He arrowed right into the pool along the zombie gut trail like the damn beagle scent hound he was. Garfield ran around to snarl at the zombie as Cheryl got Zim's leash on him, clipped him to the fence, and then ran over to the gate. Garfield, get over here! She fumbled with the padlock for a second, and then Garfield shrieked as the zombie got clawed, bony fingers into him. Cheryl kicked the gate open and fired at the zombie. A chunk of shoulder blew away. She swore and worked the bolt again. The second shot blew the zombie's head apart, bits of brain raining down into the pool. Cheryl pulled Garfield out of the water, carried him to the pickup, and got him into the passenger seat. Hilldale Vet Clinic, she shouted into her phone. She was halfway to the vet before she realized she'd left Zim clipped to the fence and called Kathy next door. No worries, Kathy said. I'll send Jaden over. He can plywood up over the window and take Zim in. I thought, said Corey from the vet's curved desk and two sleek computers, that the National Guard had swept the town. What was the point of all those checkpoints around town? Fucking zombies. Somewhere in the back, Cheryl thought, Garfield lay on a table under anesthesia, and that young vet from Chicago that didn't look like she could even legally order a weak bear or even drive a car was trying to save him. Zombies, huh? Corey said again. Cheryl pulled her head out of her bloody hands. She realized he was talking to her. What? National Guard isn't doing a good job of keeping up, Corey said. They left. Cheryl took a deep breath and blew her nose. They left? Corey looked horrified. When'd they leave? It was all over Channel 5, Cheryl said. You didn't see it? I've been working extra shifts, Corey said, trying to get ahead on my payments for the steel shutters. Cheryl had been seeing more and more of those go up. Bars on windows as well. She didn't like the look. The Homeowners Association kept sending out letters pointing out that it violated the community guidelines, but they just kept popping up. Zombies, apparently, trumped HOA rules. UTD won against the government, she said. The judge on the case ruled that getting the military involved unfairly influenced the market. Ultra Tactical Dynamics, UTD, a company built just to provide zombie and zombie home defense products, would lose all of its business if the National Guard defeated the zombie hordes, and that was fundamentally anti-capitalist and anti-American. Second Amendment rights trumped government anti-zombie actions. Those are fundamental American rights, a blonde spokeswoman wearing aviator sunglasses told reporters at a press conference on the steps of the court as Cheryl watched the news and chopped onions and carrots for a stew the previous night. News reporters noted that the CDC wasn't allowed to track zombie population anymore starting next week, and certain senators had advanced a bill to prevent funding for a zombie cure. You should buy UTD stock, Zachariah told Cheryl at Breadworks the next day. The dividend's growing and the stock is flying high after that decision. He'd been their financial advisor for 3 years now. Dale liked him. Zachariah was a high school buddy who came to town after college with a business degree to take over Dad's business, selling insurance in retirement. Dale couldn't make the appointment, told Cheryl she needed to go. But what she really wanted to do was just stay home and grieve Garfield. Damn, she'd love that dog. Fucking Dale. He's probably off drinking at lunch. Cheryl hated meeting Zachariah on her own because he never took his eyes off her chest. So she'd insisted on meeting him somewhere for lunch that was public to avoid the claustrophobic feeling of doing this in his office. I heard they stopped the plague in France, Cheryl said as she ripped a piece of sourdough bread off and dipped it into the potato soup. What do you think happens when all this is over? Zachariah scoffed. We don't need a whole socialist intervention. We've got enough firepower right here for us regular folk to stop the horde. I saw Andy take out one of them in the hardware parking lot. Just bang right between the eyes. People got out of their cars to clap. Some of the boys were talking about building blinds out in the woods around town to sit and hunt zombies with their rifles. Zachariah had a whole prospectus for Cheryl to look over. A glossy brochure full of charts that showed zombie outbreak growth, personal defense sales, and featured UTD's unique prep parties sales system that set up individuals as distributors to sell defense projects on down the line. Kind of like Tupperware parties, but for like lawn spikes, shutters, guns, and bitching swords. Dale loved going to town UTD parties. Listen, you see those videos online? Zachariah asked. He pulled out his phone and showed her a clip of 3 men in full camouflage gear on ATVs, with all of them wearing night vision goggles. Watch this, one of them giggled, and tossed a stick of dynamite into the dark. When it exploded, dark gore and body parts rained out of the night, and everyone laughed. Local government all over the country had lifted limits on what hunters could use on zombies. YouTube was chock full of men filming themselves firing on zombies with all the arms they've been hoarding ever since the NRA first started posting about the government coming to take all their weapons. Okay, look, if you don't want to invest in UTD, how about something a little more exotic? Zachariah leaned in and tapped the UTD brochures. Cheryl sighed. And what's that? You remember Randy? Chemistry Randy? Zachariah nodded. He's starting a safari experience for city folk. You come out, you do a few practice rounds on a shooting range, they load you into an open-top bus with a wire cage, run you out into the countryside, and you take pot shots from the comfort of a vehicle. 50,000 seed capital would help him get 2 vehicles with chopped tops. And who knows how much they could make? It's zombie capitalism, Zachariah said with a grin, and business is good. I'd have to talk to Dale, Cheryl said. She could barely focus. Her eyes kept watering every few seconds, and Zachariah was too focused on talking investing at her to notice she'd been dabbing at her runny nose this entire time. Oh, he's good for it, Zachariah pushed. He used to run the same business doing feral hog hunting. Same idea. You could hunt them down with just about anything because they're spreading too quickly all over the country, too. We used to go out machine gunning those things on the weekends. Tell you, the most legal fun you can have. And it did look fun. But the bottom fell out because people started importing feral hogs up to other areas where hunters were all excited to start the process all over again. And then soon you had feral hogs ripping through farms like a horde of locusts. Those things bred like rabbits. And then the local authorities would lift hunting restrictions. People would film themselves hunting boars with machine guns, and the whole damn thing would repeat. Zachariah, I really have to get going, Cheryl said. I've got things to do still today. According to the radio, stocks were up. Lots of companies building new things to deal with the zombie apocalypse. Construction up. Walls, moats, shatterproof windows, heavy doors. The hardware stores were doing well. People were taking out second mortgages or maxing out their credit cards. The economy was humming along because everything had to change for this new reality. CEOs reported that things had never been better. The Nasdaq was at new highs, S&P 500 hitting new records. A shambling corpse stepped onto the road. Cheryl screamed and swerved. Never swerve, she thought. Her car insurance agent told her that. Just hit it dead on and keep moving. Call the 1-800 number on the back when you got home. Don't park in the garage. Leave the car at the end of the driveway. Dale always mocked her fuel-efficient hybrid. Maybe he was right. Maybe he needed that big pickup that could climb over a zombie and keep going. The edge of their 2 acres needed spikes, and Cheryl needed Dale to dig a moat. She called about the steel shutters, but they were back-ordered 3 weeks. Supply chain issues. Funny, the magazines Dale had all featured heavy weaponry, nothing about ditch digging and nothing about defensive features. Cheryl dug a hole near the Japanese maple at the property marker, Garfield's favorite spot. He'd used to sit there and watch the road, waiting for them to come along the curve, then race his way out to the driveway to pace the car up to the garage. She wept as she returned to the car and pulled the still form out from the trunk. Garfield's body sagged in her arms as she walked over to the grave and slid him in. You deserved better, she said to their dog. The zombies came through 2 weeks later. They wore brand new camo, and many of them had vests with the logo for Randy's brand new zombie sightseeing company on them. Fucking figures, Cheryl muttered as she looked out of her non-shuttered windows at the undead running across her lawn, ripping up the daisies in the boxwoods. Dale! Zim started barking up a storm downstairs. Dale shouted at the dog. Then the dog shrieked, and Dale ran up the stairs, eyes wide. Safe, he gasped. She kept a shotgun by the bed, always at the ready since Garfield died. Cheryl aimed it down the stairs and fired, and Daryl stepped back up behind her with a smile and an AR-15. Together they stood on the landing and gunned the creatures, lurching up the stairs at them apart one by one until the walls dripped with gore, the banister fell over, and the stairs creaked with the weight of the dead. And when it was all done, Cheryl sat in the ruination of her carefully remodeled kitchen. We fucking crushed it, Dale shouted, pulling out himself a bottle of bourbon and stepping over a corpse. Cheryl shook her head. Dale, I'm tired of this. Why did it have to be so hard? Why couldn't they all work together? Why did everything have to be extracted, paid for, lobbied for? Why was she sitting here surrounded by all these bodies? Her dog's dead, and where had the perfectly good soldiers surrounding the town earlier gone? They'd gone to quarterly profits. Dale didn't get it. He just won. And where was Cheryl gonna go? Fucking Europe? She was an American. Her family was here. Her friends were here. Her community was here. This was her town. Cheryl sighed and grabbed a mop. Tonight she'd clean. Tomorrow she'd talk to the bank about a zombie disaster relief loan so they could start rebuilding the house, even though they were already up to their eyeballs in debt. Maybe, she thought, it was time to buy a little of that UTD stock Zachariah kept talking about.
So a lot of the comments I think are very dead on just how much this is oppression in ways that I found very stark compared to something like the big zombie property still kind of at the moment, The Walking Dead,
Yeah.
which kind of doesn't deal with that at all. You know, it just kind of wipes past the zombie apocalypse starting to, yep, it's happened and this is our new reality. And I find your story more dystopian than Walking Dead in a really horrific, cynical way. So tell me a little about like the history, because you'd mentioned at the beginning, right, that this like nobody wanted this story because
Oh,
of yeah.
well, I just, no one wanted to read it. Just like, because it came out, it was published on Motherboard's Terraform magazine right as the first week of lockdown took off.
Oh boy.
And I just was like, no one had the mental space for it. And I don't mind, right? I don't blame anyone, right? Like the moment the lockdown was announced, the moment I understood the gravity, in the weeks leading up to the lockdown, talking to people about the pandemic, um, I just looked back at that story and went like, like I feel a certain pride in nailing it, but it's like too soon, right? Like it's just the timing was just the worst. But I'd been working on this because I don't know if anyone remembers this meme, but there had been a shooting and we were having a national conversation about gun control, and we don't have to go down that whole rabbit path. But there was this meme that popped up of this guy in Arkansas or somewhere like that who was interviewed talking about his fears about gun control because he's like, what about the feral hogs that are rampaging through our backyards trying to eat our children? And everyone posted that and was laughing at it. But this one guy on like Radio Lab or one of those podcasts was actually really curious and wanted to interview that guy. So he circled back to it and called him up and tracked him down for an interview. And it turns out that like while we all laughed at that guy as some kind of like redneck, gun control person, and there are plenty of those. I live out in the country, right? Um, this guy tells the story of having moved to a suburb in Arkansas and looking out from his kitchen one day, and his kids, his 4 and 5-year-old, are out in the yard screaming because a pack of feral hogs has broken through the fence and is rampaging through the yard. And he went out there with a gun that, even though he got point blank shots, didn't really do much. And he was suddenly like, I think I need like an AR-15 with armor piercing rounds to take down a feral hog. Um, and uh, and so it turns out that there's a huge feral hog problem in red state America. Started by, and it all, like, one of those things that's weird about America is like, whenever you see a problem that just seems to be its own independent problem, when you start digging into it and you get really deep in America, right, you usually find out that when you go back 100 or 200 years or 300 years, the problem that you're currently struggling with, and you're like, why the bleep does this happen? The answer is racism, colonialism, or something like that, right? So Cortez, a long, long time ago, and many Spanish conquistadors basically imported feral hogs into Central America, right? Because as they were passing down on the boats, they would just drop hogs off, right? And they just breed like rabbits, right? And so you go down to like, as far as you can into South America, and you can no longer expedition, you still go the same route back up before you go across, because you can go across over there. So as they would go back up north, they had feral hogs that would have reproduced that they could kill and slaughter and eat. And then the next time they came back, the next batch of conquistadors would have hundreds and thousands of feral hogs to eat, right? So, and they weren't as feral back then, but as they were left in the wild, they became more and more feral, and survival of the fittest over 300 years. So the feral hogs that have descended from the conquistadors' feral hogs are some badass motherfucker, hogs, right? And these guys are coming north, right? So like people are freaking out about like, border crossings. I'm freaking out about hogs coming across the border, because what they do is they tear up farms. They're like locusts. They eat, they breed, they reproduce, and they destroy farms. And these farmers are struggling in parts of Texas and Arkansas, and all these places to handle the hog population. So what happens is local Department of Natural Resources takes off hunting caps, and they take off what you can use to hunt the hogs. And they just basically tell local hunters, hey, help us out, help the farmers out, go crazy, right? You can do anything. You can light a stick of dynamite and throw it into a pack of hogs, and we don't give a crap, right? And so what happens is you start getting these like crazy people on ATVs filming themselves gunning down feral hogs with the machinery, the weapons that you don't normally get to play with, right? They have like there are YouTube, go on YouTube, you'll see these like night vision guys tossing sticks of dynamite at feral hogs for shits and giggles, right? Some of them, I'm sure, drunk off their asses. It looks like a good time. People see the videos and then they want feral hogs. So there have been red states that have actually been capturing, these hunters have been capturing feral hogs and importing them into other states, which then causes problems with farming and ecology and all this other stuff. So it's like this sort of like mimetic, self-replicating combination of like feral hog invasion plus red state gun obsession and hunting culture. All three of them kind of combine to keep replicating this boar problem. And you can go online and you can see these boars just running through neighborhoods, and it's just like it's bananas, right? And so I looked at that, and I looked at how some of those weirdnesses of our current political situation in the US actually was creating the hogs spread, right? And I just sort of went like, well, shit, when zombies come, we're going to have the same exact problem. And then as COVID started breaking out, I went, I don't like this. I don't like what I just wrote. I'm not feeling good about this. I don't like this one bit.
That is utterly fascinating. Because like obviously with the feral hog problem, it's also a problem of there aren't. I mean, humans are basically their natural predator in the United
Yeah.
States, insofar as you can have a natural predator, because we basically wiped out most of the natural predators. Um, and so I noticed in the chat on the Discord, someone's talking about like the supply chain issues, and it's like, well, ironically, the supply chain issue is actually like our food and livelihoods could be quite decimated by uncontrolled hog populations. But
it's
also, like,
it's
that's a fun
yeah.
idea.
It's not quite the apocalypse, but I'm interested in these like self-perpetuating problems that we just cause for ourselves. So yeah, I just the unintended consequences of it was like, yeah, like in a zombie movie, it's always just sort of like, yeah, we can get out there and like if the army starts like cordoning off Las Vegas, we can contain the zombie outbreak. And I'm like, in real life, it's sort of like they're gonna be counter protesters out there going like, free the zombies. And then you'll have like people out there like taking guided tours into the middle of it so that people can hunt from like armored vehicles and be like, woo. And so it's just like take all this stuff you see around you and just like map it to this and see what this looks like. It's, holding up that funhouse mirror to real life. Someone in here said this is like, what did they say? Absurd or the accuracy of the absurdity. Thank you. Is a great phrase. I just the moment I heard this interview and this whole podcast about the pigs, the boars, the wild boars, I just thought like, oh my gosh, this is like deeply emblematic of the American condition, and I have to fictionalize it.
Well, another side to that too, which I think is interesting, and like in The Stranger in the Citadel, a bit of this too is part of, I guess, that's led to this story that you've written is in part learning the reality of a myth that we've sort of created for ourselves. This guy
Yeah,
becoming a meme essentially, but it's actually much more complicated. And when you hear his story, it actually kind of makes sense why he's so concerned.
yeah,
Uh, and in Stranger in the Citadel, you have that same kind of myth making because this is a world where reading and books have been banned as a compromise with the gods, so that they can live in this with the cornucopia with this sort of like provides them basically everything they need. But then you find out there are secrets being held by the people in power, which has quite substantial disruptions to the reality that people are living. And so by unveiling that, suddenly all this conflict arises that challenges our notions of what is real in our
yeah.
society. I don't
Well,
know if
and
you want to
and
speak to that.
yeah,
Yeah.
the dilemma becomes like, what do you do when you start to understand systems around you? What are your responsibilities? What happens when you begin to like dig at these things? Like how do it's like I was talking to some of my students the other day where I said like occasionally you run into things you don't know. I was looking for like the ultimate winter coat and for this winter, or no, 2 winters ago. So I was doing some like heavy coat shopping, and I kind of thought like I'm tired of being cold, and I'm going to be walking back and forth to this new gig I'm doing, and I want something that just makes me arrive at my destination like toasty, no matter what the temperatures are. I'm a cold weather wimp being from the Caribbean, and so I'm like looking up these like I'm looking at like Canadian forums. Like, what do Canadians argue with each other about what the best coat is? And it's like this $2,000 Arctic polar thing type situation. And as I was looking at the different descriptions of coats, I started seeing some of them had these tags that said like cruelty-free down. And I was just like, what the hell is cruelty-free down? And why do I need to, like, why is this a thing? Right. Part of it's that little like, what, what now? That kind of mainstream brain, and then another part of me is kind of like, is down cruel? How is down? What's like, oh, what's my obligation here? All right, let's start Googling. And I Google it up, and yeah, the way they get down off of baby birds is kind of flipping horrific. And like, now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it. And I now have a feeling about down, right? And how it's harvested. So now I got to go be looking for some like cruelty free down, right? Because then it's like you have to ask yourself now, okay, I didn't know I was a participant, right? I didn't know that like down could be harvested this way. It may not have always been that way, but at some point over the last 50 or 60 years, industrialization, mechanization, systems decided like this is the cheapest way to get down. I'm not going to depress everyone by talking about the details. Please forever remain in ignorance and be happy. I completely understand why that's appealing. But like having watched it myself, then I was like, I'm not going to throw out my existing down because it's already done. But I'm like, I don't think I could buy a new down jacket unless I have that little tag there now. And so yeah, it was like this whole freaking like, and do I really want to pay $50 to $100 extra? Like, I'm on a budget. And so like but you have to like start having that conversation and wonder some things. And in this story, the character turns away from it. She kind of steps up to the edge of understanding that, it's not really all her fault, all this stuff that's happening. It's not even her husband's fault as such. They're just participants in this kind of edifice. And what do they do next? And in Stranger in the Citadel, the young girl, she is a benefit of a rentier economy. And she is a benefit of a system that has decided to create tremendous inequity to benefit itself. And she's always thought that that was baked in, that that's the way it was supposed to be. And as she starts to explore her world and poke at it, she's starting to have some extraordinarily hard pieces of education, and then she has to decide what to do with that, and where do you go from there? And that interests me.
I could tell because reading that particular work, well, listening, I should say, because it's an Audible original.
Yeah,
Uh, it really made me curious about sort of, I don't know if there's a turn happening in your career because you've written fantasy, in short form, and you've had some earlier works like The Executionist, I think, is in 2011, which
yeah,
is part of a two novella piece with Paolo Bacigalupi, if I recall, he did in part of the Shared World. But I remember us having a conversation before the pandemic, which might have been the year of the pandemic or the year prior. I don't remember.
okay.
At Capricorn, when you were guest of honor at Capricorn.
That was right before the pandemic.
Yeah, February. Yeah. And I remember you talking and you were telling me about this story, and then you were working on a collaborative project that was also fantasy. And it made me wonder, because most of your career, your novels at least, have been almost all of them science fiction, very clearly
Yeah,
so. But now you've got all these much more clearly fantasy works. And I'm wondering, are we seeing like you kind of turning into a new genre a bit? Or is it
that's
just a coincidence?
a bit of both. I mean, in the short story side, I've done all of the above, and that's been fun. 120 short stories, and there's a really wide variety of all the genres in them. For the novels, I came out swinging, with science fiction, and I tended to avoid fantasy because I struggled a lot with the sort of pastoralism and the sort of American fascination and almost near worship of sort of royalty, right? And I'm British. I'm very over royalty, right? Like I technically hold a British passport, right? I'm Grenadian. I'm British, right? So like, there's a little bit of Britishness in me that's just sort of like, yeah, royal family, whatever, which makes me a very I'm technically a British Republican, which means I'm interested in a British Republic and not a monarchy, and not an American Republican. um, the the those elements in a lot of, not all fantasy. I mean, again, right? Like just, but that sort of reader fascination with those elements really kind of didn't speak to me a lot. And there was a lot of stuff that felt like fantasy didn't want someone like me, even more so than science fiction when I came into the field originally. So I did it in short fiction, but I didn't feel like I could do a Caribbean epic fantasy when I was getting started in the late 90s. I felt like I felt like I could fight a battle on one front, but not two. I could do Caribbean into science fiction, and I had like Bruce Sterling's Islands in the Net. I had Rastafarians in the space station in William Gibson's novel. I felt like cyberpunk had this little bit of space for the Caribbean in it. And that I could come in there and be like, not only do I have a precedent, but I'm actually Caribbean, so I'm going to write cyberpunk like that. And so like in the 90s, that's the only way I could envision, because it's the only place I saw science fiction, the only place I saw science fiction and fantasy playing with my homeland, and accepting it and seeing it get nominated for awards, win awards, and be best-selling. And when I saw kind of other people playing in fantasy, it tended to get relegated to like literary and quoted as literary. And I wanted to work with sort of a more popular kind of toys, and so that's why I was like, okay, so I'm gonna do science fiction in my novels, because there's a space there that I can see, and I'm gonna push into that gap and see if I can push it open. Of course, that's all bullshit, because like the moment I got to Clarion in 2000, someone handed me Nalo Hopkinson's name and was just like, here's Caribbean fantasy / science fiction. And I'm kind of like, oh, we can do anything.
Yeah.
But I'd already kind of started going down the science fiction route, and it felt like I'd kind of built something there. And so I kept going. And then like some big changes happened. Writers of color worked really hard to get the H.P. Lovecraft statue changed for the World Fantasy Award. A lot more people of color started getting published and getting recognition in fantasy. And so suddenly it felt like, it felt less scary, that maybe there were readers out there who would be interested in any of the ideas I had. And of course, Ursula K. Le Guin, Kate Elliott, Robin Hood. When you look at the female fantasy writers out there, they have been doing all of what I just described in fantasy for decades and decades and decades and decades. But I had a limited, I didn't grow up with full access to bookstores in the Caribbean. So I had this sort of like weird, the big names of epic fantasy and mostly men, that I had found in used bookstores. And so I was undereducated about what all could be done in fantasy. So you're watching me grow because I started publishing at 19. So, like the first 10, I mean, yeah, I made decisions in 8th grade that had consequences in college, that had consequences when I was first just getting published. And so like part of this has been me going kind of like, no, actually, I do have access to this whole world. I can write fantasy things. I can play in this genre, and I'm starting to do that, and have fun there too. And just kind of correcting and getting in and reading a lot of older work, like I said, particularly by women fantasy writers, who are doing all the things that I wanted to have seen, but wasn't given or never ran into in the used bookstores in the Caribbean when I was coming up. So that's just a case of me kind of course correcting and fixing that. And I'm enjoying doing the fantasy because of this. There's a little less of a wall up with the reader for me to play with some of my more radical ideas than there is in science fiction, because there's a little less baggage when you say, this is a secondary world that has nothing to do with this world. Absolutely nothing. Wink, wink. Whereas when I do something that's science fiction, if it's near future, everyone comes with their existing political baggage and they can see how you got to there from here. And if they're not here, they immediately really carve off really quickly, wanting to be sympathetic with you. So you can have a little bit more fun in the fantasy. Like, I can put together an anarchist, rotating, anocracy, group of individuals living in a village somewhere in the middle of a forest who use, magic to keep a dome over their village. And I'm not immediately going to get people coming at me saying sort of like, you leftist socialist whack job. I refuse to read this. They're just sort of like, it's fantasy. Why aren't? Yeah, sure. They're anarchists living in a forest in the middle of Mordor. There's just a little bit less resistance. People still will get there and get mad at you. But like the amount of hate mail I got for Arctic Rising and Hurricane Fever, which are me kind of focusing on ecology and these concepts I was reading about when I'm looking at the IPCC reports and Task Force Climate Change Navy reports, versus the hate mail I get for the Tangled Lands, which is the collaboration I did with Paolo Bacigalupi, which is ecological high fantasy. I get almost nothing from Tangled Lands other than people who enjoyed reading it, regardless of political spectrum, right? But like I get just like, I'm going to burn your house down level of hatred on the ecological near future books I've written, right? So like that's another thing that kind of makes me go like, oh, this is really interesting.
That's fascinating. I mean, I knew that I know that you'd faced criticism for Arctic Rising and Hurricane Fever because they're near future and they're dealing with, you know, an interpretation of a future that we could possibly exist in. I mean, that you've
Yeah.
taken considerable liberties to imagine
Oh,
still. But I suppose perhaps maybe some aspect of that is that some people view science fiction as it's supposed to be more realist,
yeah.
whereas fantasy is like, no, like it can be surreal and strange and it doesn't necessarily have to follow any rules. Whereas like,
Right.
no, you've imagined, 50, what is it, like 50 years, 60, 70 years in the future
Yeah.
for those? Yeah, no, nope, you can't. No, you missed this one critical detail. Go die in a fire.
Yeah. No, it's very much like that. And so I've had permission to actually be a little, I found space to be a little bit more edgy and kind of tackle some topics that I think if I did it in science fiction would flop a lot more than they have playing around with fantasy. Even just doing zombies, right? As a stand-in there has gotten me more kind of interesting email on that story as people have started discovering it in the short story collection than I think the science fiction would. And I don't get me wrong, I have oppositional defiant disorder thanks to being ADHD. So like when people send me like, I hope you burn in a fire, like nothing makes me want to go write a third ecological near future book more than that. Like the hope is that you'll like give up when you get that level of harassment, and it does the exact opposite to me. Like I actually have to be really careful because like if people really hate something I've done, my immediate instinct is just to go do more of it, right? Because that shit fuels me. And so I have to actually often like be like, well, but is that artistically what you would like to go do, Toby? No. Then take a beat, because doing the opposite of what someone wants you to do is also being controlled by them. So, deep breaths. So yeah, it is one of those weird little sort of conundrums that I deal with where I'm just sort of like, I'm kind of like, yes, give me your hatred, feed the dark side. I could turn that energy into just pure literature day in and day out. But it's not healthy necessarily. So the fantasy has been really nice because I can kind of go orthogonal and go all over the place and just follow things that fascinate me as they strike me. It's been really cool, and it's been just a nice palate cleanser to do these bigger fantasy projects. Which is to say that I'm in the middle of revising a 130,000 word big fat fantasy novel right now.
That's going to be really exciting. One of the things that I remember we talked sort of kind of about this before the pandemic, and so I'm hearing you talk about like thinking about your reactions to, in this case, criticism, but I suppose other kinds of inputs that could come in, and having to be more deliberative about the artistic process you go through, like where your artistic energy goes. And naturally, a lot of that has to do with you've got a day job where you teach, and then you've got, family life and all of that. So you have a lot of things that take up time, and deservedly so. Uh, and so I'm curious, especially over the last few years, have you found yourself becoming even more deliberative and more considerate about how you dedicate your writing time?
Yeah, well, it's 43. I start looking around and going like, oh yeah, midlife is kind of sneaking up towards me. And that definitely puts you in a very contemplative mind sometimes, particularly as an artist, because, like, we like to, what's my legacy? No one's going to be reading me in 50 years, let's be honest, right? Because it's like I'm a commercial fiction writer. Well, yeah. And so like, but you do kind of think like, okay, there are a limited number of novels left. You start to, as you get older, more people around you die. You see your parents getting older and less fit, and you start thinking like, oh yeah, I'm going to slow down. I can't keep going at this pace for too much longer. I've got 15, 20 years or whatever of that prime time. So what is it you want to accomplish in those 10 to 20 years? Because for a long time, my accomplishment has been like, can I publish a novel? Can I write something that people would find interesting? Can I grab your attention? Can I create space for other Caribbean writers by breaking through this boundary, or creating a space over here, or helping the community? Or can I write a fantasy novel? Would that even work? So there are a lot of like firsts, and I've kind of got most of them at this point now. And so it starts going to like, okay, so what is the body of work going to look like? What are the other projects that I want to try and accomplish before I die? So you start having those kind of like existential artist conversations and thinking about that. So I'm definitely starting to become more deliberative, to pick and choose what I do next, figure out my pace, and try to not send myself off down rabbit holes that could eat up, a year of my prime creative output.
Well, so I want to turn back a little bit then to, uh, you know, e- obviously we talked briefly about fantasy, and so clearly you've been kind of exploring, and you have a novel you're in the middle of edits on that is long and is beautifully epic. Uh, but one of the things I thought was interesting in both thinking about The Stranger in the Citadel, and then to some degree also thinking about The Executionist, which is roughly 10 years prior, and
Yeah.
it's in kind of your other work too, is you seem in fantasy, maybe more particularly, looking a lot at like the cause and effect on a systemic level of
Hmm.
limiting factors. So in Stranger in the Citadel, it's this concept that books are banned, and you shall not suffer a librarian to live. In The Executionist, it's fantasy has been forbidden because it creates this bramble, like almost infectious bramble that can swallow entire cities. And so you seem like very deliberately interested in not just ecological but societal impacts of sort of restrictions we place on ourselves and what happens when we break those open.
Yeah. Um, I'm starting to kind of grapple with some of those concepts and trying to question. Some of it's coming out of. Here's where a lot of it's coming out of in Stranger in the Citadel is that I have been teaching graduate level writing, and I'm teaching sort of undergrad level writing. And I've been doing that now a lot for the last 3 years. I've been doing a lot of workshops for 25 years. And so I have a lot of theory about fiction and a lot of things that I notice don't work in beginning writer manuscripts that I have to kind of figure out how to explain to them to fix. Um, they say like, there's that horrible adage, like, those who can do and those who can't teach, which I hate. But I stayed out of teaching for as long as I could because I was an English major and I wanted to be a writer. And everyone kept saying, "Oh, are you going to teach English?" And I was just like, "No, set me on fire." Um, and what has happened is, other people have brought me in to do workshops and teach, and it turns out that I enjoy trying to explain the underlying system, and rather than just correcting the student, right? So like to get really good as a teacher, you actually have to do that kind of, Richard Feynman said, like if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, you don't actually understand it, do you? Right? And it's kind of a pithy quote, and Richard Feynman has turned out to be like problematic, but I do kind of like that idea of like you should be able to grasp something in a way that you don't make it harder for someone who's starting out to learn, but you can kind of, it's going to be hard, but here's the theory. It's hard to execute, or everyone would do this, but here's the theory, and here's why this works here and why it doesn't. Um, and so, pulling all that theory together, I've been wanting to push back at some of the underlying assumptions. Like I'm starting to I'm worried about how narratives spread that can give us poor metaphors for understanding reality. And fiction is also responsible for some of that. So I write adventure fiction. I love redemptive violence in fiction. I love revenge quests. I deeply, deeply love revenge quests, right? I also have a lot of friends who are, active protesters, nonviolent protesters, and who've given me a lot of books and deep research on the power of it, right? I've learned a lot about violence and systems and systemic violence and intergenerational trauma from reading about the history of the Caribbean, slavery, racial violence in the U.S. in modern times, and I'm trying to square that with like my fiction in some ways, right? So we're talking about legacy now, right? And so some of the things I've been poking at are trying to figure out how do we as individuals navigate these, and how can we tell a story that doesn't immediately go to redemptive violence. Listen, I'm going to write some more redemptive violent novels. Absolutely, right? Like it's about what makes me happy as a writer. But what's also made me happy as a writer is writing big projects as well that kind of keep surprising you by putting the character, like for Stranger in a Citadel, the whole mental exercise for that is putting a character into situations where redemptive violence is excused, makes sense, works for the plot, but the character has over and over and over again decided that their values, when learning about the inequities and horrible structures of their system, has decided that systemic violence is not going to solve the problems that they have. And she keeps making choices that find other solutions. So my challenge to myself was, could I write an engaging book that pulls you through it from scene to scene, like really tightly, and keeps you on the edge of your seat, and is swashbuckling in the way that I'm known for, while still sort of examining that structure fictionally, which makes it sound really academic and like I have my head up my own ass. But that was the challenge I set for myself, right? And every time I ended up in a situation where the character was staring that hard question in their face, they found other ways around it. And that really was fulfilling for me. I'm really proud of that book because I didn't think I could do it, because I didn't get to use any of the tools that I normally use in a novel. But I love how challenging it was, because I'm getting tired of these books where I see the good guys torture people, right? The plot always sets up this false dichotomy of, well, the terrorist is holding 50 children hostage. If I don't torture this guy to figure out what the code for the bomb is so we can disarm it from a distance, then 50 children are going to die. So it's okay if I start ripping his toenails out or pulling his teeth. Like, we're doing it because we're the good guys, you know?
Yeah.
And it's becoming lazy writing. I'm seeing it constantly. And you can see me struggling with it with Pepper in the Xenowolf novels, right? There's some torture scenes in that. Pepper has some torture scenes in the Arctic Rising, right? And by Arctic Rising, I'm switching to this idea that like he has like a ultimate lie detector, right? That's kind of the dodge I used for that. But by the time I get to Stranger in the Citadel, I'm like, no one's freaking torturing anyone if they're a good person, only if they're a bad person, right? Because I'm gonna draw a line in the sand and say that like I try not to make didactic fiction, but like, what is my legacy if I'm another brick in the wall of this good guys torture thing? right?
Mm.
Like someone has to kind of push back on that a little bit. And so I'm trying to do that a little bit. It's just show an alternate way.
That's fascinating, especially since this is coming out just a little bit after like Game of Thrones is concluded, a few years after. I can't. It felt like a
Yeah.
thousand years since COVID, but uh,
What even
which
is time anyway?
who cares? Time is irrelevant. But it is really interesting because when you think of something like the Game of Thrones model, which has Game of Thrones has had quite a significant impact on fantasy even before it was a television show,
Yeah.
but where everybody's kind of monstrous in that
Yeah.
show, differently monstrous, but they're all kind of horrible people. There's almost nobody at the end of that we could argue is good in a sort of, generalist sense. But that's also kind of its point, whereas you're kind of doing the opposite to say,
Yeah.
well, how do we imagine people with values who adhere to those values, who can still be considered good, and how do we do that in a way that seems narratively consistent rather than just, I don't know, like pie in the sky kind of a perspective. Yeah.
And that's not to say that like that stuff shouldn't exist. I think like grimdark. I love reading grimdark. I mean, toss me a Joe Abercrombie novel, I lose 2 or 3 hours without even realizing it. Right. Um, I think there's got to be space for all of that because that's part of
True.
the width of the human condition, right? And when I talk about like, I teach at a peace studies university, right? So I'm definitely kind of like everyone's in a whole other realm of conversation about violence in the media on my campus. But I think like, I look at, Japan, which is a very modern, functioning, low crime environment, and they're some of the most violent media made in the world, right? So it's not, I don't believe that violent media creates violent culture. I think like violent media can be purgative. It can be, you can use it to get that out, right? That there's nothing wrong with wish fulfillment. And I'm happy to be part of the community that creates wish fulfillment for everybody. But I think like we have to have a full spectrum, and we have to be careful about the stories we tell. And so I think grimdark works best when it shows us the corrupting nature of violence. The reason I read Joe Abercrombie is because I think Joe Abercrombie has a very strong sense of like this shit corrupts these people, right? And we're looking at them trying to struggle against it, right? And that's why it's great, great fiction. And there are many other writers who are making that point. But then some stuff ends up feeling like masturbatory to me. And I'm not going to name names, but like some stuff I'll read and I'll be just like, so yeah, this is same old, same old. There's nothing being done here. This does, there's, and all fiction doesn't have to be didactic. You can write whatever the fuck you want and do whatever you want with it. But I am in a stage as an individual where I'm just kind of looking around and going like, I don't want to be a part of adding torture as a good thing, because I think if we do that too much and we tell those stories too much and it gets excused, we end up with a situation where we're going to have a generation or two after us raised on those stories in the middle of a war, doing horrible things to civilians because they have never been taught better, which is what we can see right now happening in the world, right?
Yeah.
There are, occupying soldiers of a large nation that are raping children as a form of revenge against Ukraine. And that comes about due to environment of what they're consuming, right? They're consuming media and entertainment and everything that is dehumanizing Ukrainians and letting them think that this is okay, right? That comes out of somewhere, right? And we don't want to ever, I don't want to be part of a larger culture that finds itself in a spot like that. And I don't want to contribute to that necessarily. So I've just been thinking about stuff like that. Sounds like I'm turning into an old square, um, I don't know.
No, yeah, I don't think it makes you an old square. I think it's just a very different process and thinking and philosophy of writing that you've made very clear is your
Yeah,
journey, and not I'm telling everyone else you have to do my journey, which I think is an important thing to note. And sometimes maybe the internet loses that nuance, but
I'm always
yeah.
scared of just being another brick in the wall, right? Because like when I talk to students and I say like, because I do a lot of panels on like, how to do diverse characters or things like that, right? Or at least I used to. I kind of refuse to do those anymore. But like one of the things I talk to them is like, inside of a story, you can have something that's stereotypical, and the story logic will surround it and make it seem inevitable. And it's probably logical for the story in and of itself. I've even done it several times, right? You fall into the, but for this story, this person has to be like this, right? And the problem isn't your story. It's all the other stories and your story adding to the weight of it, right? So it's like you think of all these other stories as bricks in a wall, and are you adding another layer to that wall? And how big is it so far, right?
Yeah.
And so when I tell, I once, one of my short stories is Death's Dreadlocks, and people are often like, oh, don't say that about it, but I criticize it and show people how it is another brick in the wall, right? Because it shows like an Africa that draws from these common images that we see in media all the time. Those like the technicals, the the Toyota pickups with the guns on the back. It's got like a, food camp. It's dry. There's no infrastructure, right? And like the Africa I read about when I'm doing history and talking to my friends is specific. It's a specific country. I'm not talking to Africans. I'm talking to Nigerians or South Africans or Egyptians, right? There are like skyscraper skylines in Africa and everything in between, and of course, like, what do? I grab the first thing for this story, and it worked for the story, but I put another brick in the wall of this image of Africa as an Africa that is this monolith, right? And I deeply regret that, because that's not even the Africa I know, right? But it was just lazy. It was just lazy world building, right? And the story was published, by a group of, who were not adding to that edifice, right? The editor was a person of color. Many of the other authors were people of color. People from Africa didn't call me up and try to cancel me or anything like that. But I do regret, it's a small brick, but like, once I was done with it, years later, I looked at it and I said, like, okay, that's the thing that you need to not be doing, right? Is adding a brick to the wall. I added a brick to the wall, and I feel kind of bad about it. Am I proud of the story? Yeah, I did the damn best I could. Have people love the story over the years, including some people have, read it from Africa and noticed it. But like, it does put a brick in the wall, and even they have said that. Like, I'm looking forward to you showing another side of it, and you just gotta take that in, right? Like, that's just, it's just the way it is.
Well, I hate to end on a slightly downish note, but we don't have any time left. We've blown well past when we were supposed to stop, because we were saying lots of things, which is okay. But very briefly, do you want to make sure folks know where to find you and your work?
Absolutely. www.tobiasbuckell.com. Sign up for my newsletter, and then I'll send email once every month or two telling you what's up. You can find me on Twitter at Tobias Buckell, and in bookstores of choice.
Yeah, and do get The Stranger in the Citadel, which is, I believe, your most recent novel-length work.
It's at Audible. It's free at Audible if you have an Audible account, so you don't even have to spend a credit on it. It's there on the Plus catalog, and there will be a print edition coming from Tachyon Press at some point in the next couple of years. So we're putting that together. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Tobias, very much for being here. And thanks, everybody in the audience, for your comments and for being here. We appreciate it very much. And go check out at 8 p.m. Central Time. He's giving his keynote. So, all right.
All right. And
Take care,
Discord.